Today, we're covering the Everest climb, where a millionaire snapped his fingers at his Sherpa like a waiter, and nature delivered vengeance. When that Sherpa reached out to save his life, Welford's abrasive response set in motion a failure that took down bodies more than one. It was April 18th, 2016. The trail from Lukla climbs northeast along the Dudh-Koshi River, gaining altitude through pine forest and stone-walled villages before the trees thin and the rock takes over. The river runs below, gray-green and loud with snowmelt, audible from the trail, but rarely visible for long. By day 4 of the approach, the expedition team was already above 9,000 feet. The air was thinner than most of the climbers had ever breathed outside of an airplane cabin, and it showed. Legs burned on flat ground. Rest stops came more frequently than they had 3 days before. Trace Albright, 51, a semi-retired structural engineer from Boise, Idaho, had done this before. He was on his second attempt at Everest's South Col route, and he knew the approach the way a driver knows a long road. Not fondly, but with the particular competence of someone who has already made the primary mistakes. He kept a journal throughout the expedition. The habit had served him on his first attempt, grounding him through the long recovery days and the stretches of altitude-induced sleeplessness, and he saw no reason to stop. Dax Welford, 44, walked ahead of him most of that fourth day, or tried to. Welford was a commercial real estate developer from Houston, Texas, who had built a mid-sized portfolio of industrial and retail properties across the Gulf Coast region over roughly 2 decades. He had paid $85,000 for a guided summit package through an established Kathmandu-based guiding agency. The package included equipment support, supplemental oxygen, Sherpa assignment, fixed rope access along the South Col route, and all meals from base camp upward. It was his first expedition to the Himalayas, and, by his own accounting delivered to anyone within range of his satellite phone, it would not take long. On day 4, he told someone back in Houston that he would be standing on the summit in 3 weeks, maybe less. Albright overheard the call. He noted it that evening in his journal, later referenced in testimony, that Welford seemed to be approaching the mountain the way he likely approached a property acquisition, a transaction with a predictable close date and clear deliverables. Would the mountain prove as negotiable as a property deal? Foaming Norgay was 38 years old and from Fortsay, a village in the Khumbu Valley situated at roughly 12,730 feet, where generations of Sherpa families have lived close enough to Everest to watch its plume of wind-driven snow from the rooftops on clear days. He had reached Everest's summit 6 times by the spring of 2016. He supported 3 children and an aging father on the income generated across the climbing seasons. He was widely regarded within the professional climbing community of the Khumbu, guides, logistics operators, icefall doctors, base camp staff, as precise, professional, and undemonstrative. He was not known for complaint or for drawing attention to himself. He carried 55 pounds of client gear up the approach trail. He said very little. On day 4 of the approach, somewhere on the river trail between Phakding and Namche Bazaar, Dax Welford snapped his fingers at Foaming Norgay to get his attention. Albright saw it happen. He said nothing. Foaming adjusted the load on his back and kept walking. The first clean sightline of Everest's south face opens near Namche Bazaar, a trading hub at around 11,300 feet that functions as the last substantial settlement before the high country begins in earnest. The mountain appears at a distance as a dark triangular mass, its upper flanks carrying a horizontal plume of snow, driven off the summit ridge by winds that can exceed 100 miles per hour. Could the mountain's looming presence foreshadow the human tensions climbing with it? Everest rises to 29,032 feet, where air pressure and oxygen drop to about 1/3 of sea level. The body adapts slowly, producing extra red blood cells over weeks of high altitude exposure. Base camp sits at 17,600 feet on the Khumbu Glacier's lateral moraine. Towering seracs up to 50 feet crack and groan nightly as the glacier shifts, forcing climbers to either sleep through it or go sleepless. Albright noted in his journal that arriving at base camp on his first attempt had felt like arriving at an edge. Not the romantic version, but the plainly literal one, where the familiar stops and something else begins. Expedition head guide Rajan Chetri, 46, was from Kathmandu and had reached Everest's summit 11 times by the spring of 2016. He gathered the full expedition team on the day of base camp arrival, 9 climbers and 7 Sherpas. His briefing covered the rotation schedule, oxygen management, radio protocols, emergency procedures, and conduct expectations. The conduct section was brief. That afternoon, during the equipment check, Foaming Norgay repacked Dax Welford's summit bag, a standard Sherpa practice as proper weight distribution above 26,000 feet affects balance, fatigue, and survival. Welford took the bag, called Foaming the help, and no one responded, though 2 Sherpas heard him. Could disrespect in the death zone carry consequences heavier than any bag? Everest acclimatization follows a strict, non-negotiable pattern. Climb high, sleep high, descend to recover, repeating over weeks to build red blood cells for the death zone. Many deaths occur when climbers rush this process. The Khumbu Icefall, just above base camp, is a 2,000-foot cascade of shifting ice moving 3 to 4 feet per day. The route, maintained by Icefall doctors, uses ladders across deep crevasses. Climbers cross in crampons, often before dawn, while towering seracs can fall without warning. It's the deadliest South Col section. More fatalities happen here than on the summit ridge. Rajan Chetri noted it matter-of-factly, like describing a tricky highway interchange. Dax Welford moved through the icefall faster than the pace Chetri set for the team. Speed in the icefall is not an advantage. It means longer exposure under seracs, less precision on the ladder crossings, and a physiological burn rate incompatible with the 16-plus hours that would be required above 26,000 feet later in the expedition. Chetri flagged it. Welford dismissed him and kept moving. During a rest stop at Camp 1 at 19,900 feet, Albright asked Foaming how many times he had crossed the Khumbu Icefall over his career. Foaming considered the question. He estimated approximately 90 crossings. He had first crossed it at 19 years old, carrying loads for an expedition he was not summiting with. He had not owned his own climbing gear then. He did not own it now. The agency supplied it. Could sheer experience truly counter reckless decisions made by others? The second rotation of the acclimatization cycle brought the team to Camp 3 at 24,500 feet, in a section known as the Yellow Band, a visible geological stratum of pale limestone that was oceanic seafloor before the Indian subcontinent collided with Asia and compressed the sediment upward over tens of millions of years. The rock holds marine fossils at nearly 25,000 feet above sea level. Climbers move past them clipped to fixed ropes, with the Lhotse face dropping thousands of feet below their crampon points. Wind at this altitude is consistent and physical. It leans into a person rather than pushing at them intermittently. On the ascent to Camp 3, Welford became aggressively argumentative during a rest stop. He directed the agitation at Foaming, accusing him of slowing the group's pace. Albright recorded the exchange in his journal. Chetri pulled Welford aside and spoke privately. What Chetri said during that conversation was not documented. Welford's response was audible to nearby climbers. He had paid for a summit, not a babysitter. Hypoxia impairs cognition and emotional control before obvious physical symptoms appear, causing irritability, poor judgment, and uncharacteristic aggression. At 24,500 feet without supplemental oxygen, all climbers experience measurable cognitive decline. But Welford's behavior had begun at 9,000 feet, long before altitude became a factor. During the recovery at base camp, Chetri emphasized high-calorie intake to offset extreme caloric burn at altitude. Welford used his satellite phone and ate inconsistently. Foaming noticed fraying on a fixed rope near Camp 2, reported it to Chetri, and it was replaced before the next rotation. Would small, careful interventions be enough to prevent catastrophe? On May 19, 2016, the meteorological window confirmed by forecasting services in Kathmandu aligned with the expedition's acclimatization timeline. The final push began. The South Col is a quarter-mile-wide saddle between Everest and Lhotse, littered with rock and ice, exposed to relentless jet stream winds that shred tents each season. Above 26,000 feet in the death zone, the body consumes muscle for energy. Vision fades, cognition slows, and coordination fails. Physiological inevitabilities for all climbers. Summit day exposure often lasts 16 to 22 hours. Welford was placed on supplemental oxygen at Camp 4 as scheduled. He set his flow rate at 2 liters per minute. The standard rate for guided expedition, clients on the South Col route, runs between 3 and 4 liters per minute during the summit push. The supplemental oxygen system used on Everest mixes bottled oxygen with ambient air through the mask. It does not deliver pure oxygen. At 2 liters per minute at 26,300 feet, the effective oxygen environment experienced by a climber is roughly equivalent to an altitude of approximately 24,000 feet, still well inside the death zone's physiological damage range, and substantially below the margin built into the expedition's planning. Foaming Norgay noticed Welford's flow setting. He reported it to Chetri. Chetri adjusted the rate upward while Welford slept. Welford woke before the summit push. discovered the change, and turned it back to 2 liters per minute. This was the first documented instance of foaming intervening directly for Welford's physical safety and being overruled. Would intervention be enough when the climber refuses help? Suki Vang, 29, a nurse from Minneapolis, was at Camp 4 simultaneously with a separate guided expedition. It was her first 8,000-meter peak. She and Albright exchanged a few words near the tent lines during the preparation period. She noted the tension visible in Welford's group. It was, in her later description, apparent even from the outside. Something in the body language, the spacing between team members, the way Foaming and Welford occupied the same space. At Camp 4, the second major incident between Welford and Foaming occurred in front of multiple witnesses. Foaming was fitting Welford's oxygen mask before the summit departure. At approximately -30°F in wind, wearing expedition-weight gloves built for warmth rather than dexterity, fitting an oxygen mask is a slow and tactile process. The mask must seat properly against the face. Any gap in the seal reduces the effective oxygen delivery rate. The fitting was taking time. Welford struck Foaming's hands away from the mask. The action was observed by Albright, Chitri, Vang from approximately 40 feet away, and Sherpas from both expeditions in the adjacent area. Welford told Foaming to carry the bags. Foaming stepped back. He said nothing. Chitri asked Foaming privately whether he wanted to rotate off the summit team. The grounds existed. The conduct Foaming had absorbed across the weeks of the expedition would have been sufficient justification to withdraw from the assignment. Foaming declined. He told Chitri they were close to the top and he would finish the job. The team departed Camp 4 at 11 p.m. on May 19th. Temperature at the South Col was approximately -40°F, with consistent wind within the forecasted range for the weather window. Midnight starts are standard on the South Col route. The timing provides maximum margin for a summit arrival before 10 a.m., with adequate remaining daylight for the descent. Would the darkness conceal risks that daylight would reveal? The headlamps of 9 climbers and their Sherpas formed a broken line moving upward along the triangular face in full darkness. Crampons bit into ice over rock. At -40° with an oxygen mask on, conversation is an expenditure most climbers stop making early. The fixed ropes disappeared upward into darkness above each headlamp cone. The balcony at 27,600 feet is the first formal checkpoint on summit day, a broad ledge on the southeast ridge used for oxygen assessment and team evaluation. Chitri documented the team's condition there in the expedition record. Welford's pace on the ascent to the balcony was fast, notably so for a client at that altitude on his first high-altitude expedition. Chitri's record flags the pace as a concern. At extreme altitude, speed is not an advantage over consistency. Moving fast burns the body's remaining glucose at an accelerated rate and produces the kind of exhaustion that, above 28,000 feet, can become terminal. The climbers with the highest survival rates at extreme altitude are frequently those who move slowly and without interruption. Suki Vang's team had departed Camp 4 45 minutes after Welford's group. Her team's pace placed her close enough to observe what followed and far enough behind to remain outside the direct hazard zone. The south summit at 28,700 feet marks the beginning of the most cognitively depleted portion of the climb. At this altitude, processing information requires measurably more time. Spatial judgment degrades. The automatic decision-making experience climbers rely on becomes unreliable in ways that are not subjectively obvious. The climber experiencing impairment does not typically recognize the extent of it. Could unnoticed cognitive decline become a fatal misstep? Albright described his own mental state near the south summit in later testimony as resembling the experience of thinking through wet sand. He reported misjudging a step on the fixed rope and Foaming reaching back to steady him without a word, without breaking his own movement. The Hillary Step, a 40-foot near-vertical rock and ice wall at 28,840 feet, is the South Col route's final technical obstacle. It creates a geographic bottleneck where climbers ascending must yield to descending parties, who are often most exhausted and have limited options on the face. A climber from a separate expedition was descending the Hillary Step as Welford's team ascended. Welford did not yield. He moved into the descending climber's space on the feature. Foaming reached forward and guided Welford back to a hold, a physical correction on a near-vertical face at 28,800 feet that almost certainly prevented one or both climbers from losing their footing. Welford shoved Foaming. Foaming caught his fixed rope. He did not fall. In the impact, his oxygen mask was knocked partially loose from the seal against his face. Albright was directly below on the fixed rope. He watched the shove happen. He was close enough to see Foaming catch the rope and reach up with one gloved hand to attempt to reseat the mask against his face while remaining clipped to the line. He heard Welford say something into the wind. He could not make out the words through his own mask and the ambient noise at that altitude. Above them, Chetri had not seen the shove directly. From his position higher on the route, Foaming's momentary stop looked like an oxygen equipment check. Would anyone truly understand the severity of what had just happened? The team continued upward. No one called a halt. Every witness who later gave testimony described this as the moment they could not fully explain. The team reached the summit in the gray pre-dawn light that arrives at 29,032 feet before it reaches the valleys below. The sky held no color worth describing. The exposure was total. The horizon curves visibly from the summit on a clear morning, the Earth's geometry apparent to the naked eye. Wind was present, but within the survival margin. There was no ceremony. Welford took a photograph. It was recovered later from his camera. The descent began within 20 minutes of arriving at the top. The weather window had been narrowing since before they reached the summit. Chetri set the pace downward. On the descent from the summit toward the south summit, Foaming Norgay's pace declined. It was not abrupt. Climbers slow on descent from exhaustion, from accumulated hypoxia, from the physical cost of 18+ hours above 26,000 feet. No one identified the deceleration as medical in those first minutes. But by the time the route brought the team near the south summit, the gap between Foaming and the climbers ahead of him had widened past what normal fatigue explained. Could anyone recognize the warning signs before it was too late? Foaming sat down on the ridge near the south summit. He did not call out or indicate distress. He stopped moving forward and sat. Albright, descending behind him, asked if he was all right. Foaming nodded. He attempted to stand. He could not coordinate his legs to execute it. Chetri was radioed from below and climbed back up. He examined Foaming's oxygen equipment. The mask seal had been compromised since the Hillary step. The mask, knocked loose in the collision with Welford and partially receded by Foaming, with one hand while clipped to the rope at 28,800 feet, had not held a proper seal. Across the 90 minutes of continued ascent, the summit stop, and the beginning of the descent, continuing to move at extreme altitude, continuing to physically steady other members of the team, Foaming had been breathing air that leaked around an improperly seated mask seal. The oxygen his system was rated to supply had not been fully reaching him. The gap between what his body required and what it received, over 90 minutes at that altitude while under physical load, had compounded into collapse. Chetri's radio transmission to base camp was recovered with the expedition records. The base camp operators who received it described his voice as controlled and shaking in the same breath. Could calmness in crisis conceal the urgency of a life-or-death situation? The ledge near the south summit at 28,700 feet is barely wide enough to sit safely. Chetri and Albright stabilized Foaming, who was conscious but unable to stand or follow instructions. His fingers were unresponsive, and his lips were cyanotic, a sign of severe oxygen deficiency. His symptoms matched high-altitude cerebral edema, or HACE, where brain swelling impairs motor and cognitive function. At that altitude, no medication can reverse it. The only chance of survival is immediate descent. But Foaming could not move. Dax Welford was below the ledge on the descent route, continuing downward. Albright called toward him. Welford kept moving. Chetri radioed base camp. The transcript was later obtained by journalists covering the season. He gave coordinates and described Foaming's symptoms with the specificity of someone trained to communicate under this kind of pressure. Base camp advised assisted descent and provided what guidance was possible. Helicopter rescue above approximately 23,000 feet is not operationally feasible under standard conditions on the Nepalese side of the range. Could guidance alone save a man too high for rescue? Suki Vang's team reached the south summit during this period. Vang was the only medically trained person at that location on the mountain at that time. She confirmed the symptom profile. She and one of her Sherpas joined Chetri and Albright in the effort to move Foaming downward. Moving an incapacitated person at 28,700 feet is not a rescue operation in any conventional sense. The people making the attempt are operating well inside their own physiological limits. Each person is managing oxygen supply, balance, cognitive deterioration, and the physical demand of moving another body down technical terrain at near the edge of survivable altitude. They They are doing this without rest, without warmth, without adequate fuel. The group moved foaming approximately 200 vertical feet downward over 90 minutes. At some point during that descent, no witness could later identify the exact moment. Foaming Norgay lost consciousness. He did not regain it. Foaming Norgay was declared dead at approximately 27,600 feet, the balcony, at around 3:30 p.m. on May 20th, 2016. He had been on the mountain for 16 hours. He was 38 years old. In her written testimony submitted to the expedition agency and the journalists who covered the story, Suki Vang described his death in a single sentence. He did not scream, he did not fight, he simply stopped. Dax Welford reached Camp 4 on the South Col ahead of the rest of the team. He radioed base camp to confirm his summit and report that he was safe. He did not mention Foaming Norgay in the transmission. He did not describe any of the events that had occurred above the South Summit. Camp 4 at 26,300 feet is survivable under correct conditions. Functioning supplemental oxygen, a properly sealed shelter, adequate caloric reserves, rest, and a body that has not been subjected to 9 or 10 continuous hours of death zone exposure on an inadequate oxygen supply. Welford had been running at 2 liters per minute since the previous night at Camp 4. Against the direct guidance of his lead guide and against the active intervention of Foaming Norgay, he had maintained that rate through the entirety of the summit push and descent. Within approximately 1 hour of Welford's arrival at Camp 4, a support Sherpa from a neighboring expedition noticed that Welford's tent had not been properly sealed against the wind, a condition that, at 26,300 feet and driven cold, is not cosmetic. He approached the tent to address it. He found Welford unresponsive inside. Welford's oxygen tank was empty. Whatever cerebral deterioration had been building across the summit day, through 9 to 10 hours of inadequate supplemental oxygen at extreme altitude, through sustained physical exertion, including a shove at 28,800 feet, through the full length of the ascent and descent, had reached a point beyond which the body could sustain basic function. The arrival at Camp 4 had not reversed what the death zone had already done. A Sherpa from the neighboring expedition attempted CPR at 26,300 feet with a body depleted by a full summit day on insufficient oxygen and the probable onset of cerebral edema. Resuscitation was not achievable by any means available on the South Col. The attempt was made regardless. Dax Welford was pronounced dead at Camp 4 South Col. He was 44 years old. Albright arrived at Camp 4 shortly afterward, descending with Chetri's group. He found Welford already dead. He recorded in his journal that he stood at the tent entrance and did not feel what he had expected to feel. He did not authorize the journal entry to be reproduced. Dax Welford's body was recovered from Camp 4 by a Sherpa team contracted through the guiding agency and transported by helicopter to Lukla, from which repatriation to Houston was arranged through a publicist retained by the family. The obituary that appeared in the Houston business press described his 2 decades in commercial real estate development, his drive, and his love of outdoor challenges. It did not describe the events of May 19th and 20th, 2016, on the South Col route. It did not mention Foaming Norgay. Foaming Norgay's body could not be recovered from 27,600 feet without placing additional climbers at unreasonable risk. Per the wishes of his family, and consistent with the tradition maintained in the Sherpa community for those who die on the high routes, he was left on the mountain. A ceremony was held in Fortsey village. His 3 children attended. He was the 11th member of the Fortsey community to die on Everest. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.